friends. I guess it's time to get started here. I'm still using the St. James mug that Sam so nicely loaned to me, so I just want you to notice that. Welcome this morning. Today we're continuing our discussion of Jewish-Christian relations after the Holocaust, and we've looked at the remarkable document of Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, and then last week we looked at the other remarkable document from the Lutheran Church, where they engaged the heritage of Martin Luther both positively and negatively. It's a really amazing precedent for our own day, where we think that the way to deal with problematic ancestors is just to get rid of them, forget about them. And the Lutherans thought, no, you can't do that. What you have to do is take the core of what's positive about Martin Luther and then use it to criticize what was not positive about Martin Luther. So it was a really good discussion last week too. This week, I was going to go in a different direction. I wanted to have more good news when we're looking at this week, and then 2 weeks from now, we won't have forum next week, but 2 weeks from now we'll look at the way the Jews respond to these Christian overtures of friendship and reconciliation, etc. And I was going to do a statement by several Orthodox rabbis. There was a much more positive reception of what Christians were doing, but then I thought, I think it would be really interesting to look at Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, because he's a modern Orthodox rabbi who taught at Yeshiva University, and he lived between 1903 and 1993, nice old life, and he wrote an article right during the heyday of this, a year before Vatican II, called Confrontation, and I thought it would be really, and actually it's highly influential in the Orthodox Jewish community even up to today. So I thought it would be interesting actually to look at somebody who didn't like the direction this was all going in. Like the idea that Christians were entering into dialogue with Jews, but he didn't like the way it could be happening. And so I thought that would be a good thing to look at in terms of, actually there were questions last week too, like what do Jews think about this? Well, here's one who has very strong opinions about the limits of this kind of activity. And I apologize, we never got to the Episcopal statement last week, so I'm abandoning our own tradition. If we have time today, we can talk about it, but I don't want to impinge on Soloveitchik as well. He's a very interesting person. He was part of a long line of rabbis, great rabbi scholars and teachers in Lithuania. He comes from modern-day Belarus. It wasn't Belarus back then, but it was part of the Russian Empire. And moved to Boston. That was always his home, but he taught for a long time in Yeshiva University in New York City. So I imagine he was riding the train quite a bit between Boston and New York. And he was what one calls a modern Orthodox. So a straight up Orthodox would not study contemporary philosophy, right? And a straight up Enlightenment person, the Haskalah it's called for the Jewish Enlightenment, would not study the Talmud. There were people though, and Soloveitchik's one of them, who studied modern philosophy and the Talmud. And so they're called modern Orthodox. So they're not averse to studying modern thought and even using it in a way to interpret the Talmud, right? And so he's a modern Orthodox scholar. So he read Kierkegaard, he did his dissertation, he got a doctorate in Berlin in his early training in Hermann Cohen's philosophy, and Hermann Cohen is a great Jewish philosopher based on Immanuel Kant. So he's very up to speed in terms of contemporary philosophical thought, but also a brilliant Talmudic scholar. And so when he was hired at Yeshiva University, they hired him in philosophy. And then they realized that his Talmudic studies were just amazing, and so they shifted him over to being a Talmudic scholar, but he never lost interest in philosophy. He was very interested, for instance, in Søren Kierkegaard, was another one of his people. He was both drawn to him and driven back from him, as we all are, so he was part of a long tradition of that. So he's a really interesting man and very, very brilliant. He ordained over 2,000 rabbis during his time at Yeshiva. And so there's this whole generation of Orthodox rabbis who were trained by Rabbi Soloveitchik. They called him Rav, which is a title of great honor. Rav Soloveitchik. I used to go to the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and David Hartman, who organized that, and after whom it was named, was one of his best students at yeshiva. So I've met a number of Soloveitchik rabbis in the modern Orthodox movement, and they're all brilliant the way he was. So we're looking to, and the other thing is, and Lorraine knows this because we talked about this before in the Mercy Seminar, he wrote a couple of books that are really worth reading if you're interested. One of them is called Halakhic Man, and it's a phenomenological study of a scholar of halakha. The halakha it means the way to walk. And so it's the way Jews understand rabbinic law. It's teaching you the way in which to walk every day. And Halakhic Man is somebody who formulates and teaches halakha, and it was actually written about his father. So he's not doing a phenomenology of himself, he was actually doing a phenomenology of his father. And so it's a wonderful example of getting the inside view of what a Talmudic scholar would be like. The other book, which is much more accessible, I think, to us, is a shorter book called The Lonely Man of Faith. And we'll see a lot of Lonely Man of Faith items in here as well. So those are two of his best known works in terms of his wider publications. So what was Soloveitchik up to? Well, in 1964, he writes this article called Confrontation. And 64 is a year before Vatican II comes out with Nostra Aetate. So dialogue, but the aftermath of the Holocaust is very much alive. Regret on the part of Christians for their contribution to anti-Judaism is very much in the air. The desire to reconcile with the Jewish community, given all the wrong that was done, and repent, is very much in the air. And so he's very aware of this, living in New York City. Abraham Joshua Heschel is in New York City during that time as well, at a different school, and Heschel is very involved in this. He's a really good friend of Reinhold Niebuhr's, for instance. And so Heschel is having discussions both at a social level and at a theological level. And so there are Jews in the United States who are, in fact, participating in Jewish-Christian dialogue in a very theological as well as sort of social-political level. And Soloveitchik doesn't like this at all. Soloveitchik doesn't like this at all. And so he wrote Confrontation to fire a shot across the bow of the Orthodox community that this is not what we should be doing. And we'll have to see what his reasons are. I think one of the reasons you can see right away is in America in particular, he calls the Jewish community the community of the few, and he calls the Christian community the community of the many. And the community of the many has no idea the effect they have on the community of the few, right? It's overwhelming. And so for him, and Christians don't understand Judaism, which is true. They think it's the Old Testament, which it's not. I mean, it's related to that, but it's not. You don't just read the Old Testament and that's Judaism. And so he's very worried that this dialogue is going to be overtaken by Christians, and they're going to basically tell Jews what's really going on again, only now in a friendly way, right? And so I think it's worth looking at him because it's a cautionary tale about how trying to develop a sympathetic and reconciling relationship can actually be just as destructive as not respecting those boundaries. So let's just dive into to his thoughts. I hope that's helpful as a background, though. He sets out, he loves this word confrontation, and there are a couple senses of well, there are three senses. One is the general human confrontation with the world, and Jews participate in that just like everybody else. The other is the confrontation with God, in covenant with God through the law of Moses at Sinai. And then the third confrontation is the confrontation between Christians and Jews, right? So he's actually using the same word to talk about all three dynamics. And the opening paragraph is about the confrontation that sort of sets the table for the whole thing. The confrontation as a human being and the confrontation as a covenant member. So he says, we Jews have been burdened with a twofold task. And notice it's burdened. I always thought that was really, we're all burdened with one of them, maybe. Anyway, we Jews have been burdened with a twofold task. We have to cope with the problem of a double confrontation. We think of ourselves as human beings, sharing the destiny of Adam in his general encounter with nature. And he talks about this also in The Lonely Man of Faith. and as members of a covenantal community, which has preserved its identity under the most unfavorable conditions, confronted, there's that, by another faith community. So in other words, as a covenantal community, they have preserved their identity even though they have been hard pressed by Christians. So he's not going to say Christians, right? He's going to say another community. That's us, another faith community. We believe that we are bearers of a double charismatic load, that of the dignity of man and that of the sanctity of the covenantal community. In this difficult role, we are summoned by God, who revealed himself at both the level of universal creation and at that of the private covenant, to undertake a double mission: the universal human and the exclusive covenantal confrontation. And where Christians tend to go is the universal human. We're all human, right? And think that therefore means that our faith, the differences of faith, doesn't really matter. We can just work it out. I've even heard people say, I heard a presentation on Elijah down at the synagogue just up the street, and it was a Muslim, it's typical, it's like the opening of a joke, a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian, right, talking about Elijah, and they weren't, I was disappointed because the Christian position was vastly underrepresented by the person representing Christianity, but anyway, toward the end, inevitably you're going to hear, if we just listen to each other, we find out we're not that different at all. You've probably heard this a million times. It is Soloveitchik would say, that is absolutely not true, right? What you're mistaking, he would say, is the universal human for the particularity of the covenantal community. And when push comes to shove, what a Muslim's faith is, and what a Christian's faith is, and what a Jew's faith is, are dramatically different. But we tend to, we just want to get along, and we're all the same, we're all one thing, and that's what Soloveitchik is trying to say. We are all one thing. We're all human. That's really important to him. We're one thing that way. We relate to each other universally. But on the other hand, we're utterly unlike one another, and we need to take that very seriously. And in fact, he would say in Lonely Man of Faith, within each covenant or faith community, we're unlike our compatriots, right? And sometimes we feel like we can't even communicate with other members of our own faith community because of the singularity of the religious experience we have. So this singularity is both communal and individual at the faith level. Whereas there is, in social relations, etc., there is a more universal, actually there should be a completely universal approach. So that's the problem. The problem is this dialectic, if you will, between the universal and the particular. And what happened in the Enlightenment, for instance, and the Jews went through an Enlightenment as well, the Haskalah, what happens in the Enlightenment is you use the universal to start wiping out the particular, right? Those are all remnants of an unenlightened age, and we have to use reason to come with universal truth that unites all of us, and not these particular religious traditions that just divide us, right? And so the Enlightenment pushed really hard to get rid of particularity and go with universality. And the Jewish community went through that as well, and the Orthodox resisted it. What makes Soloveitchik interesting is he didn't resist philosophy, he just resisted the tendency that philosophy has to annul these particular differences. So does that make sense though? So every faith community, certainly Muslims have this view, and certainly Christians have this view. We have this view of the universally human, and then the particularly Christian faith, Muslim faith view. So everyone's involved in this twofold confrontation, at least in those three traditions. But that doesn't make them the same. It makes them have a similar agenda, but it doesn't make them the same. So then he talks about, well, what is the individuality of a faith community, right? So he doesn't want to talk about the universal here. He wants to talk about the faith community. He says, the individuality of a faith community expresses itself in a threefold way. I love him because he has numbers, right? So especially when you're teaching, it's always good to have in the margin 1, 2, 3, exactly. So it's in a threefold way. First, the divine imperatives and commandments to which a faith community is unreservedly committed must not be equated with the ritual and ethos of another community. And this is very Jewish, right? If you are describing your faith, would the first thing out of your mouth be divine imperatives and commandments? Not at all. See, that's his point, that's the way Jews think. He's not saying that's the way other faith communities think at all, but he's thinking, actually he is thinking that, but he's thinking about other faith communities in a very Jewish way, which is very salutary for me, right? So we think, oh God, laws and imperatives and commandments, oh, it's horrible, it's so, and it's like, for Jews, the delight of a life is doing what God commands, right? That's what you want to do. And the more commandments, the better, right? The rabbis are like, let's get some more commandments here. So it's this is his point. Christians don't get it. They can't get it because their whole ethos is completely different than the Jewish ethos. So anyway, first, the divine imperatives and commandments to which a faith community is unreservedly committed, so this isn't just kind of tentative, must not be equated with the ritual and ethos of another community. So you can see, for us, he uses ritual and ethos. For the Jews, he uses imperatives and commandments. Each faith community, and so that would be Christian as well as Jewish, is engaged in a singular normative gesture reflecting the numinous nature of the act of faith itself. I think that's a beautiful sentence. Each faith community is engaged in a singular normative gesture, so an overall posture, if you will, reflecting the numinous nature, and others, transcendent nature of the act of faith itself. And it is futile to try to find common denominators. Right? This is what he's really worried about. There's nothing in any particular faith gesture that can be found in another faith gesture. That's his claim. Particularly when we speak of the Jewish faith community, whose very essence is expressed in the halakhic performance, and halakha is, as I said, the way to walk. So those are the authoritative rabbinic teachings that come out of both the Torah, the written Torah, and the oral law, and rabbinic disputation through the ages. So the halakhic performance, which is a most individuating factor, right? I mean, Christians, if you ever thought about halakhic performance, did you ever even heard the phrase, right? So we just don't have a clue that in the Orthodox Jewish community, it's all about halakha. It's all about halakha, right? And performing halakhic works every day, which is the most individuating factor. Any attempt to equate our identity with another is sheer absurdity, right? So what Jews are doing at the level of faith is not like what anyone else is doing. And so we can't say, oh, that's like when no, it's not. I mean, it might be, we might get a glimpse of the numinous character of it by talking about our own faith, but probably not, because we wouldn't understand what the differences are. Then he says, second, the axiological awareness of each faith community is an exclusive one. Axiological means axioms, right? Sort of the raw doctrines of faith that we stand by. The axiological awareness of each faith community is an exclusive one. It's not really shared by anyone else not in that community. For each community believes, and this belief is indispensable to the survival of the community, that its system of dogmas, doctrines, and values is best fitted for the attainment of the ultimate good. So in other words, we believe that faith in Christ and doing what Christ commands is the way to live and is the way to eternal life, right? And if you give up on that, go home. I mean, what's the point? Go to the theater. I mean, do something else. And actually in our own day, this is Randall speaking now, we're in great danger. The liberal mainstream Protestant churches are so ecumenical that any boundary anyone says, oh no, if you believe that, then you're definitely not a Christian anymore. Oh, that's so exclusive. That's so harmful. That's so patriarchal. That's so white privilege. That's so whatever you don't like. We can't think that way. So we just tear another border down, in which case, where's the boundary? Where's the boundary of being a Christian and not being a Christian? This is what he's worried about in 1964. It's only gotten worse since then. And he's aware Christians are now in this ecumenical phase, and they're very, very willing to say, well, at the end of the day, doctrines don't matter. You probably heard this phrase, creeds divide, deeds unite, right? So don't focus on creeds, what we believe, what we should do. Focus on deeds. We all have to work together. Right? What that's doing is substituting for Soloveitchik. It's substituting the second confrontation with God, with the first confrontation, which is social. And he would say, of course deeds unite. That's where we're all universally human. But that doesn't mean creeds are bad. It just means they're doing something else, right? And so I think in our own day, we're in real trouble. I think and this is me now, but this is one reason I like reading him, is that what are the things that Christians absolutely believe and will never give up on? We need to be clear about that in our own minds, or else we might as well just go home, right? Because then this just becomes a social event, and we're doing good works, fine. But there are other institutions that do a much better job at social work than we do. You know, we're kind of amateurs on that level, so, you know, just join a political party or something like that. Anyway, so the axiological awareness of each faith community is an exclusive one. He thinks that's a good thing. I'm not so sure we think that's a good thing anymore. It's systems of dogmas, doctrines, and values. Even those words now have a bad valence, don't they? If I say we need to cling to our central dogmas and doctrines, like, oh, Zachman's really gone off the deep end. He's some sort of fundamentalist now, right? So, and yet every Sunday we say the Nicene Creed, right? So is that negotiable? Oh, that sounds divisive to me. Let's get rid of that, you know. So anyway, so that's his second point. Third, each faith community is unyielding in its eschatological expectations. At least they should be. And that means what is coming at the end of time, right? And Christianity and Judaism are both eschatological. They became that. Judaism wasn't, I mean, Israel wasn't that way initially. There wasn't anything in the future that was, you know, coming to replace what's here now. But we were going to hear this Sunday another beautiful passage from Revelation about the new heaven and the new earth, right? And so is that just sort of something we're may or may not be hoping for, or is that absolutely something we're looking for? It perceives the events at the end of time with exultant certainty and expects man or humanity by surrender of selfish pettiness and by consecration to the great destiny of life to embrace the faith that this community has been preaching throughout the millennia. In other words, we're inheriting a tradition that goes back thousands of years. And so is it just a take it, or, I mean, are we just gonna say, yeah, but we're gonna let that go, or is that really, really important to us? So for instance, both Christians and Jews expect a Messiah at the end of time. It's not the same guy, right? Or person, it could be a female. Anyway, so that's what he means. I mean, that's just one example of the unyielding expectation. Also, Jews pray for every day, 3 times a day, they pray for the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem, and the restoration of the city of Jerusalem, and the restoration of the Davidic king in Jerusalem, and the reign of peace in Jerusalem, etc. And they're not talking about the heavenly Jerusalem, right? So what Christians, when they say Jerusalem, they mean the heavenly Jerusalem. God forbid you should be in the earthly Jerusalem. When Jews pray that, they mean the earthly Jerusalem, even if heaven transforms the earthly Jerusalem, right? So that would be another example of the end time differences. And he's not saying who's right and who's wrong, notice. He's just saying each tradition does this, each faith tradition does this, and he's thinking especially of Christians and Jews, and they're really different. They can't yield on that, right? So then he says standardization of practices, equalization of dogmatic certitudes, and the waiving of eschatological claims spell the end of the vibrant and great faith experience of every religious community. It is as unique and enigmatic as the individual himself, and that's the lonely man of faith. So at this level, when you encounter a member of another faith community, it makes you feel isolated. You don't feel like you can be understood. And maybe even within your own faith community, you don't feel you can really be understood. Because for him, every individual has a unique experience with God, even if it's shaped in the Orthodox Jewish community. And that you can tell he's also speaking autobiographically, that even his own wife didn't really know the depth of his own experience, and vice versa. So even within marriage, we remain mysterious to each other. And he thinks that's actually a good thing. You know, we don't all want to just meld into one thing. And so this distinctiveness means that even in the individual relationship within a faith community, there's a confrontation, right? Not aggressive confrontation, but a confrontation which means you're confronting something that's going to resist your will, right? It's going to resist your understanding. So then, what are we to do now that the Jewish community and the Christian community are trying to find a more positive confrontation? Because we know for 2,000 years, thereabouts, it was very negative. Christians went out of their way, and it's really uncanny, and it happens over and over again, and it's now happening in the liberal church too, to point out their positivity by making Jews the negativity, right? So think about the way the gospel passages get interpreted. A woman with a hemorrhage comes up and touches Jesus, right? That's so different than the purity of the rabbis, who would never let a defiled person. That is baloney. That's a complete artificial construction made up by Christians to contrast our wonderful being over against the negativity of Jews, right? It happens all the time. The Pharisees are legalistic. We are forgiving. You know, it's just like, so listen, all the time, it happens all the time. Christianity, and the Jews don't do this. They don't say, isn't it wonderful to be a Jew? Because those Christians are just full of crap, you know? So they may think that, but that's not identity forming in the Jewish tradition. It's also not really identity forming in the Muslim community overall. We tend to think it is, but it really isn't. Islam is all about submitting to Allah, and submitting to Allah doesn't include glorifying your submission by contrasting it with that of others. So it can happen, but it's not, in Christianity, there's something baked into Christianity that its beauty is enhanced by the ugliness of Judaism. It's just baked in. And so that's what I think he's really worried about. So given that history, how do you go about this confrontation between Jews and Christians? Well, first of all, he plays his Enlightenment hand. He's very much a citizen of the United States, and so he's very much interested in universal human rights and the dignity of every human being. That comes right out of the Enlightenment, right, which is where our Constitution comes from. So he says, it is self-evident that a confrontation of two faith communities is possible only if it is accompanied by a clear assurance that both parties will enjoy equal rights and full religious freedom, right? And this is where his concern for the community of the many comes in. We shall resent any attempt on the part of the community of the many, that's us, to engage us, that is Orthodox Jews, in a peculiar encounter in which our confronter will command us to take a position beneath him while placing himself not alongside but above us, right? And so, and this actually is native Christian attitude, that we're a superior evolution of religious faith than Judaism is, and it's really kind of right in our bones. And so really we're above and they're below. We'll be nice. We want to be nice to them. We've been mean to them, and now we want to be nice to them. He says, a democratic confrontation certainly does not demand that we submit to an attitude of self-righteousness. Okay, that's hard to believe that Jews would look at Christians and think we're self-righteous, but that's what he's talking about. Taken by the community of the many, which, while debating whether or not to absolve the community of the few of some mythical guilt. What's the mythical guilt that the community of the many wants to absolve the community of the few of? They killed Jesus. And he's like, baloney, right? And now you're going to say, oh, and that's what Vatican II does. They didn't really, that's not really a sin that they committed that ends their relationship with God. And he's like, we're not interested in being absolved in that guilt. We never thought we were guilty in the first place. So you guys just need to get over that. Don't come over and forgive us of that alleged guilt. So whether or not to absolve the community of the few of some mythical guilt completely ignores its own historical responsibility for the suffering and martyrdom so frequently recorded in the annals of the history of the few, the weak, and the persecuted. In other words, Christians need to look at what they did to us and quit forgiving us for something we didn't even do. Right? It's really, I'll tell you, that'll get you up. That'll wake you up, right? So it's like this whole article is like a huge glass of cold water being thrown in our faces. So what we need to do, and actually the documents, even Vatican II, the Lutheran statement, the Roman Catholic statement, the Episcopal statement, really understate what happened. They really understate how viciously Christians spoke about and treated the Jews throughout history. And so it's like the Episcopal statement says, I just love it. Christians need to be aware that hatred and persecution of Jews have a long, persistent history. Whose history? It's like, have a long, persistent history just out there? No, Christians need to be aware that their hatred and their persecution of the Jews has a long and persistent history. But notice they don't say that, because that'll never pass the General Convention. Right? You'll never get all the votes. So we have to lie and backpedal and downplay and put it in the passive sense. Jews were hurt, right? No, we hurt the Jews, right? So Soloveitchik's not wrong at that point. That what we need to focus on is our own historical responsibility for the suffering and martyrdom so frequently recorded in the annals of the history of the few, the weak, and the persecuted. Those histories that we don't even know, right? What the history of the Jews has been. So, and then he talks about, condescendingly displaying a sense of compassion with the community of the few and advising the many not to harm or persecute the few. He said this is very condescending and patronizing. Such an encounter would convert the personal Adam-Eve meeting, which is a personal confrontation, into a hostile confrontation between a subject knower and a knowable object. It's really brilliant. So what he's saying is when Christians encounter Jews, they objectify them, right? So we're the knowing subject and they're the known object. They're not living people of faith like us. They're not living human beings like us. They're now those Jews, right? Or I want to know what black people think, right? So we would call it essentializing. He would call it objectifying, right? So that's that relationship of encounter, and notice it's at the Adam and Eve level, not at the faith level. He said that's not going to fly. So if you're interested in me as an object of your knowing, just go away, basically. Soliciting commiseration, right, is incongruous with the character of a democratic confrontation. So we're not there to have a pity party, right? There should rather be insistence upon one's inalienable rights as a human being created by God. So treat me with dignity. If you're going to enter into a confrontation on this level, again, it's not on the faith level, it's on the level of a human being, then confront me as a genuine human being with dignity and respect. Don't confront me as a known object with you as the knower. I mean, it's a good, and so that's the universal human. So Christians tend to do two things, right? One is they're convinced that they're superior to Jews. We have the living temple, they had a dead temple that was destroyed. We have the living spirit, they have dead law. I mean, you can just go down the line. So we have that faith superiority position. Then we also, as Western thinkers, objectify Jews, and we're the knowing Enlightenment subject, and they're the known object. So, and that's a tendency we have with any number of things. It's not terribly surprising. So you can see that he was not meaning to endorse this Christian-Jewish dialogue on its own terms. He thought that these issues were not being confronted, and they needed to be confronted before anything positive could happen. So he thinks that there can be confrontation, but it has to be aware of its own limitations. And this is where his students didn't always agree with him. Like David Hartman wound up disagreeing with him about this, but it's still worth seeing what it was he said, because it was very influential in the Orthodox community. He said, in light of this analysis, it would be reasonable to state that in any confrontation we must insist upon four basic conditions in order to safeguard our individuality and freedom of action. So our is the Jewish, right? So we have to ensure our own individuality, because it's going to get swallowed up, and we'll talk about that in a minute, one phrase in particular, and our own freedom of action. In other words, we don't want to be hemmed in. First, we must state in unequivocal terms the following. We are a totally independent faith community. We do not revolve as a satellite in any orbit, nor are we related to any faith community as brethren, even though separated. And that's the way the Roman Catholic Church started to talk about them, separated brethren. They also talk about us that way, separated brethren. People confuse two concepts when they speak of a common tradition uniting two faith communities such as the Christian and the Judaic. How many times have you heard the Judaic-Christian tradition?
Yeah.
Right? It's a complete chimera. This is me now as well, so I agree with him completely on that. It obscures everything. Because what's going to win in the Judeo-Christian tradition? Christian. It's going to swallow up everything distinctive in Judaism, right? And so that combos phrase is for him the whole problem. And the community of the many, you would never find a Jew saying the Judeo-Christian tradition. You'll find Christians saying it though, and that's another way of swallowing them up. They're just kind of a prelude to what we're about, and what we're about is the most important thing. So he actually has a point here, even if you don't want to go all the way with his own criticisms. He says this term may have relevance if one looks upon a faith community under a historical cultural aspect, so it's certainly true historically, and interprets its relationship to another faith community in sociological human categories, describing the unfolding of the creative consciousness of man. So there is a way in which it would make sense. However, when commitment and involvement are necessary, the whole idea of a tradition of faiths, plural, and the continuum of revealed doctrines, which are by their very nature incommensurate and related to different frames of reference, is utterly absurd, unless one is ready to acquiesce in the Christian theological claim that Christianity has superseded Judaism. And this shows up, by the way, the supersession shows up all the time. We'll probably hear it in church, if you didn't hear it already. Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us. What is that saying? That the Passover lamb is a prelude to Christ, and that the true Passover is Christ, and he's been sacrificed for us. That's what he's talking about. Where it's so native to the way we think, theologically, liturgically, everything else, that Christianity, of course, supersedes Israel. That even when we talk about Israel, we talk about it in a way that points to Christ, that's been fulfilled in Christ. There's not, and by the way, he would say there's nothing wrong with that. Just don't get us involved in that, right? Just realize that's your own distinctive, individualized, incommensurate faith tradition. But don't try to put us in the template of, and you had the human, earthly sacrifice of the Passover. And that's fine, but that's a preliminary stage to the real thing, right? So we're very much, we're just habituated to that. We can't help it, I think. But that means we're not talking about Jews when we do that. As a faith individuality, the community of the few is endowed with intrinsic worth, which must be viewed against its own metaphysical backdrop, its own understanding of ultimate reality, without relating to the framework of another faith community. And then he takes on Augustine in particular. For the mere appraisal of the worth of one community in terms of the service it has rendered to another community, no matter how great and how important this service was, constitutes an infringement of the sovereignty and dignity of even the smallest of faith communities. So in other words, say, and the synagogue was great because it spread the Hebrew scriptures throughout the world, and then we prove that Jesus is who we say he is by means of those very scriptures. So thank you, Jews, for doing us this great favor, right? And Augustine says, it's a blessing of God that the Jews were there with their scripture because it proves the preaching of the church. So that's a position he's especially upset about. But also Karl Barth saying that the Jews represent the sin of humanity and therefore do the church a service because it shows the forgiveness of sin in Christ. I mean, so there are these double ways of seeing the synagogue in service of the church. And then finally, and this is the one that really took hold in terms of Orthodox participation in Christian Jewish dialogue. He says, second, the logos, the word in which the multifarious religious experience is expressed, does not lend itself to standardization or universalization, right? But it does. See, this is the problem with language, is that it can express a very individuated faith experience, but words tend to become universalizable. And so when we see the same word show up, like you see the same word compassion in a Buddhist text, and you see it in the New Testament, you think they're talking about the same thing. They're not. They're because we don't see the whole framework in which that word is working. And so that's what he's worried about. The word is does not lend itself to standardization or universalization. Well, actually it does, but he would say we have to resist it. The word of faith reflects the intimate, the private, the paradoxically inexpressible cravings of the individual for and his linking up with his maker. So this takes place even at the individual level, that our word of faith is actually communicating something that can't be communicated, right? And that's true in the individual level, and that's true then at the community level. It reflects the numinous character and the strangeness of the act of faith. You can see why he'd like Kierkegaard at this point. of a particular community which is totally incomprehensible to the man of a different faith community. And that's a very strong claim. So there's nothing that a Buddhist says, for instance, that a Christian's going to be able to understand. Or there's nothing a Christian says that a Jew is going to be able to understand. And there's nothing that a Jew says that a Christian's going to be able to understand at the level of faith. Right? Not at the level of Adam, not at the level of the universally human, but at the level of faith. And this is what David Hartman finally came to disagree with him. That no, actually it's not easy, and it's not perfect, and it's imperfect and clumsy and everything, but we have to talk about that level as well. But I don't want us to turn to David Hartman right away, because I think this is a really, really important statement. So he says, hence it is important that the religious or theological logos, or word, should not be employed as the medium of communication between two faith communities, whose modes of expression are as unique as their apocalyptic experiences. And then this is his category. The confrontation should occur not at a theological, but at a mundane human level. There all of us speak the universal language of modern man, or modern humans. As a matter of fact, our common interests as Jews and Christians lie not in the realm of faith, but in that of the secular orders. And that's really where they did meet. For instance, Abraham Joshua Heschel marched with Martin Luther King Jr. and Reinhold Niebuhr and Theodore Hesburgh of Notre Dame for civil rights, right? Wholeheartedly. Jews were completely in favor of the civil rights of blacks in particular, not only because of their common humanity, and here's where it gets a little tricky, but also because of their own experience of slavery and freedom, right? And the constant honey trap that they get in, the way anti-Semitism puts you back in the box of oppression even when you try to get out of it. And so he's looking at that, right? He's looking at the Jews participating in civil rights, for instance, and is completely endorsing it. That's the level at which it should take place, not at the faith level, he would say. So you shouldn't have theological conferences in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims talk theology, right? Well, this actually happened. This changed my life, actually. But it's interesting the way it did happen. So anyway, so does that make sense? I mean, this second one actually is the most important one. So whatever happens in Jewish-Christian confrontation, it has to happen only at the level of, Pride Week or whatever it is. It kind
of smacks of dualism to me, though. I'm having a hard time with that a little bit, because to me it feels like it should be and both, not either or.
Right. So for him, it's either or. For him, at the universally human level. It's everything. It's universal, right? So you can't say as a Jew, I'm not interested in human rights or the dignity of other people because I'm Jewish. My own particular. And actually, we're seeing that now. The Christians are saying, we can't affirm transgendered rights because we're Christian. Soloveitchik, that's the wrong argument. You can't make that argument. You have to argue on universal categories if you're talking about social relations at that level. But he would say, yeah, it's not dualistic because there's many faith traditions. I mean, think of all the faith traditions there are just in India. Mm-hmm. And so for him, and they have found this historically, they're incommensurate. Like Hindus and Buddhists aren't talking about the same thing. They may learn a lot from each other, but they're not talking about the same thing. And they're not living the same way, and they don't have the same hopes, and they don't have the same fears, etc. And then Hindus differ from one another. Mm-hmm. You have non-dualistic Hindus who meditate and withdraw from the world, and others who do puja at temples and offer food to Shiva, etc. So even within Hinduism, there is no Hinduism. Even within India, there are very diverse religious expressions. So it's not dualistic. It just means that for him, each faith tradition, and he's mainly talking about Christian and Jewish, but it would apply across the board. Each faith tradition has something at the core of it that's incommunicable to another person of another faith tradition. I don't think he's wrong.
No, I could go.
And what we tend to do is we tend to think we're all talking about the same thing at the end. Just because we all talk about Elijah and we say some similar things about Elijah, we're really all the same. And it's not true. It's because we don't know enough about the whole framework in which Elijah makes sense to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, that we don't see the differences. So it's not really dualistic, but it is pessimistic. It's saying faith communities can't understand each other. We can deal with each other with equality and dignity. See, that's the advantage of the United States. It's a miracle. That's why Jews have thrived in the United States. It's really the Jews have a land. One is the United States and the other is Israel. And when Israel was founded, very few Jewish Americans moved to Israel because they had a home here. Now, I'm not so sure how at home Jews are feeling now, but back, for most of our history. And it's because they were treated with dignity and respect at the civil realm, and that they had religious freedom. So we weren't telling them what to think or to do. So it isn't, but it's not dualistic, but I see your point. It means that there are certain boundaries that can't be crossed, right? That must be respected, which probably goes with human dignity, right? And human dignity really means, to me, every human being is indefinable in terms of anything else. They're uniquely individual, and that has to be respected. And so the faith community of the Jews or Christians, he says the same thing about Christians, is uniquely individuating. So when we try to share our faith with Jews, they don't know what we're talking about. And they don't. They don't, it's like, other than being insulted sometimes, but other than that, they don't know what we're talking about. So that, I'm not saying that he's right, because his student David Hartman figured out a way around this. And the way around it is to get Jews, Muslims, and Christians in a room reading each other's primary texts with no privileged interpreter in that space. And when you do that, you learn very quickly how different things are for each tradition. But you also can learn. You can learn from the other without ever reducing their otherness, something about them and about yourself that you wouldn't have known otherwise. So I think he wasn't aware that this was happening. If it's just happening at the level of dialogue without actually studying the concrete texts, especially the authoritative texts of another tradition, you can in fact blur the distinctions, and we're all saying the same thing. But David Hartman's approach to, and he came right out of this school, was to focus on the very things that he said you shouldn't focus on, doctrine, faith, statements, etc., but do it without anyone being privileged in the room, right? And so I think it was actually a brilliant thing, because it showed in a very concrete dialogical study way where these boundaries actually are, and didn't just insist on them like right out of the gate. But it's still, I think that he's still very influential today. And it's for those of us in the community of the many, I think it's a really helpful pushback on our own efforts, oftentimes of goodwill, right? Christian goodwill can be very oppressive to those who are the objects of it. So anyway, are there any, yes, Mel?
The dualistic mind is just so habitual.
Yeah.
Just speaking for myself, I'm realizing more in my own person, and just reading a few things that, especially meditation, is to get out of it.
Right.
To get out of
right.
it, you're just constantly judging all the time, and I understand this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so really, what he's talking about is it happens on both levels, and it's a longer article, but I can't remember if he addresses this. But the Enlightenment in particular reinforces this. I am the thing that knows. I'm the thinking thing, and then everything else is an object of my knowledge, including other people. But I think that it doesn't just come from the Enlightenment. I think it's just the way human beings think, and so it's very hard to get out of that. And then you can't, because if you think that way, then the Christian knower, know this person that, this is the Jew, right? And so I'm going to get to know that person, or, whoever. We do this in our personal relationships, regardless of faith community. So getting out of that, so you actually are vulnerable yourself and open to what is being presented to you, it's really hard. It's really hard. We like the shortcut, right?
I had to figure out, after last week, where did I get this attitude about Jewish people?
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't in my family.
Right.
My family did not ever talk to me. They didn't. My family's very uneducated in a sense, and even in whatever level, religious or whatever. Where did I get this?
Yeah.
Where did I get this attitude? Is some kind of osmosis. I don't know. I was just trying to figure out where did I get this feeling?
Right, no, it's a really good question. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do this series in Forum, is to ask ourselves, because it's certainly a question for me too. Where did we get this? And then once you start asking that question, you really do start to get signals in our scriptures. You hear it virtually every Sunday, right? The positivity of Jesus, the negativity of his opponents, right? And then the scribes came to test him, and then the Pharisees came and they wanted to kill him, and then Caiaphas wants to kill him, and then the people want to kill him, right? And so the view of Christianity, it's amazing people don't wind up being deeply anti-Jewish, because the Gospels would lead you to think of the Jews as just negative, mean adversaries. Then you read the book of Acts, and the apostles are going around to synagogues, and the Jews want to kill them, and they're driving them out, and they're whipping them, and all this stuff. So it's very hard to escape it. In fact, I'll just conclude. The Episcopal Church came out with these guidances, theological and practical guidance for the Episcopal Church in Christian-Jewish relations, and they say at one point, this is an amazing list, we acknowledge that unjust stereotyping, which is what you're talking, of Jews by Christians persists, continuing to harm Jewish people in the present day. And notice this is 60 years after Soloveitchik wrote this, so it would have been good for people to read Soloveitchik, as it has for centuries. We acknowledge that anti-Judaism, this is an amazing list, anti-Judaism is expressed in a wide array of present practices in the Episcopal Church. Listen to this. Our liturgical texts, our interpretation of scriptures, preaching, devotional practices, poetry, iconography, hymnody, academic writing, pastoral advice, and educational resources. In other words, it's everywhere. It's gone viral, and it has been viral for millennia. And that's how it shapes us. It just, isn't that an incredible list? That was written 4 years ago. And they're saying it's everywhere. It's in everything the Episcopal Church teaches and does. It's really scary. So that's the question. I mean, and Soloveitchik was aware. We really haven't, in 1964, no one was doing this kind of work. To confront on our own, not by asking the Jews, please forgive us, but confront on our own what we have done, right? And what we've thought and how we present these things. So until we do, it's just going to keep perpetuating itself, because it just washes over us Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, and in informal conversations. And you don't have to be some bigot. I mean, we make the mistake of thinking, oh, it's some Southern cracker bigot. No, it's not. It's in really well-thinking, smart, well-intended, smart people that think this way, right? Of course we think this way. So anyway, that's a really good question. And how to free ourselves from it is really tough. It's really, really tough. Without then doing what Soloveitchik warns us against, and that is saying we're really all about the same thing. We are not all about the same thing. So how do we acknowledge our uniqueness, and even some things we believe that would be offensive to Jews and vice versa, without then hating each other, and without painting each other, one's beautiful, one's ugly, one's nice, one's bad, kind of thing. That's the problem, is that Christianity praises itself by distorting Judaism and Jews. Makes itself look good by making the other look bad. We all do that, right? But we do it, Christians do it habitually. It's just like, it's amazing, actually. So, yeah.
David
but it's
Brooks, made me just think of David Brooks' book, his recent one about knowing somebody deeply.
Yes, yeah.
It's about listening.
Right.
And getting rid of the judgmental
Right.
mind. That's it. As our men's group started listening, the
Oh.
first part of it is on YouTube.
Ah, okay,
We
good.
listened to the first half of it, and I suggested we listen to the second half, because it really brought up a lot of good questions about how we feel.
Oh, good.
How we don't listen.
Right, we don't.
How we don't listen.
We don't. And that's what Soloveitchik, that's what I learned at the Hartman by Soloveitchik's student, is how to listen and be challenged. Say, no, that's not what I'm saying, because it's like, no, it's not. Okay, but we don't. That's always our problem. We don't listen. Or if we do listen, we're thinking as we're listening of how we're going to respond, and that's not really listening. It happens especially in context of suffering, when someone is talking to us about their suffering, we're thinking immediately about what am I going to say that's really going to help the situation. And really, don't say anything. What's going to help the situation is listen. Because when you're suffering, you feel all alone. And if somebody sits in a room with you and listens to you and doesn't say anything in response, that's like the most healing thing that can happen. But our tendency is to, like, certainly mine, I want to look smart, I want to look pastorally wise and all that stuff, and then it just totally gets in the way, right? And the person's like,
those are David Brooks' exact words. He talks about himself.
yeah, no, we're all guilty of it. It's like we're all stuck in this. So, so your question's a good one. How do we get out of this is the task, and it's not easy. But I know from experience, the only way it happens is to listen. Right, so if you really want to know what's going on in the Jewish communities, because the Jewish tradition is very multifarious, listen, ask questions. You know, that we never do that. we want to come across like we know everything, but ask questions and then listen to the answers and then think about it. So I think that's what's really been lacking is. And I think at that point, Soloveitchik's advice that we encounter each other at this universal level, you'd actually start encountering each other at the faith level too, but indirectly. And then you might actually start listening to what other people are saying in a way that you wouldn't be able to hear otherwise. Anyway, but it's a good,
Thank you.
it's a good question. No, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for bearing with me. We're over time again. So,